The question of the day is, which party is most corrupt, the Democrats or the Republicans? I'd like to first of all start off this video by clarifying I completely reject the duopoly. The Democrats and the Republicans are basically two sides of the same coin. They serve the same masters, the elites, the corporations, the billionaires, the people who have bought and paid for them. People like Donald Trump, who even admitted as much initial campaign in 2016. People like Donald Trump buy and pay for these politicians to make them legislate in their favor against the will of the people. Part of the scam is keeping us focused on the other, focused on the people with different politics from ourselves, while the left is distracted with the right and the right is distracted with the left. We aren't paying attention to what the people at the top are doing. It's the top against the bottom. It's the elites against we the people. It's not about conservative versus liberal. So I want to make that very clear. We're talking about two very, very corrupt parties filled with liars, filled with heartless people that don't really care about the suffering of Americans. Republicans and Democrats alike, both guilty of this psychotic conduct. While Americans die, people like Pelosi have ice cream in their $20,000 fridge and look down at us like we're nothing to her. While Americans die, people like Cruz and Green and Gates put on a show, political theater, playing with the emotions of their base, all for their own self-interest. So I wanted to make that very, very clear. So if you're looking for me to point out which is the good party versus the bad party, I'm going to disappoint you. They're both bad. However, I want to specifically look at some of the facts regarding corruption in both parties. So I can't really answer specifically. There's a lot of parts to this, but I have some data points that I want to share with you that can help you assess the level of corruption of the parties. So this is govtrack.us misconduct, legislator misconduct database. This is 456 instances of alleged and actual misconduct by legislators in the United States Congress from 1789 to present. All right. So a couple of graphs that they show here to begin with. So here's a graph over time. So as you can see, the idea that things as they have always been is not the case. This country has become more and more and more corrupt over time. You can see corruption was pretty low, at least reports of corruption were really low in the beginning. Then there was a rise from the 1830s all the way to 1860. Then it fell down into 1880, kind of stayed steady, a little rise in the 1920s. And then while Germany was having fun, 1930, 1940, 1950, 1960, things were pretty consistent. We can see the bulk of a lot of what was happening in this time from 1870 to it seems like maybe 1950 was the blue, which is bribery and corruption. So a lot of bribery and corruption, especially in the 1870s, a lot of that going on. Other crimes spiking in 1860, not sure what those other crimes are, but bribery took hold 1870, and it stayed pretty much, the largest share, one of the largest shares for quite a while, till the 1960s. We see there was a period of time where ethics violations spiked a little bit here in the early 1900s. And then we see things just went out of control at around my birth, ironically. So in the 1970s, we see a massive jump in these violations. A significant spike in ethics violations. That's one of the biggest ones. Bribery and corruptions is right behind that. And then it looks like equal parts of campaign and elections issues, and then other crimes. This rises significantly going into 1980. We see campaign and election issues rising in the 1980s, along with ethics staying about the same, ethics violations. Then the ethics violations absolutely swells in the 1990s. Campaign and election stays about the same. See, the campaign and election issue started around 1970. Then we see in the 2000s, we see that the campaign and election misconduct rises in the 2000s. We see ethics violations dropping down a bit. We see more corruption spiking there. Then we see a massive spike in the 2010s of ethics violations, big time. Campaign and elections double. Sexual harassment and abuse, big spike. Bribery and corruption, rising again. But the biggest thing is a massive swell of ethics violations. Interestingly enough, this is around the time that we elect Donald Trump. We see historic amounts of ethics violations and corruption. Then in the 2020s, so now we have a change of administration. Biden is now president. We see a significant drop in ethics violations, massive drop in campaign and elections, and we see a little bit of a drop with bribery and corruption, and a little drop with other crimes. That's the timeline. And we're going to look at who's doing what in a second, so stay with me. This is consequences of misconduct and alleged misconduct over time. So what have been the consequences? Have we been getting more harsh, less harsh? So red is fines. There has not been a lot of fines, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. Not a lot of fines. First bit of fines we see 1990s. Massive amounts of fines in the 2020s. I wonder who's getting fined so much in the 2020s. This would be under Biden. I don't really see a pattern other than censure seems to be fairly consistent from the 1800s to the 2000s. I mean, we see it rising a little bit in the 1860s or so. And then it's kind of like on and off, but it seems to be the most consistent measure taken. We start to see conviction in court from 1900, somewhat. We see that somewhat throughout. Then in 1970, we start to see pleaded in court popping up, spiking in the 2010s under Trump. Now let's look at who these people are. So here are these people. Republican, Republican, Democrat, Republican. 3 Republicans to every Democrat. Are the Republicans 3 times as corrupt as the Democrats? I doubt that, but that's how things have started. Democrat, Republican, Republican. I believe Madison Cawthorn has recently been found guilty, potentially. Don't quote me on that. Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. Republican, 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 Republican. Massive issues with that one. Republican, Taylor Greene. Republican, 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 Democrat, Democrat, Republican, 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 Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Democrat, Republican, 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 Democrat, Republican, 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 Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Democrat, Republican, Republican, Democrat, 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 Republican. Holy smokes. Matt Gaetz. Republican, this is 1999. Republican, 2015. So this is under Trump. Because I know dishonest actors and tribalists are going to say the reason why so many Republicans are being fined or whatever is because of the dishonest, corrupt Democrats doing their political tricks. And they're going to ignore people like this who have these issues under Trump, right? So when the Democrats are in charge, the reason why Republicans are in trouble is because it's the Democrats. And when the Republicans are in charge and Republicans are still getting in trouble, it's because of what now? Let's not talk about that. Let's find a red herring to distract. That rhymes. Republican, Democrat, Republican, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Republican, Democrat, 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 Republican, Democrat, 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 Democrat. All the Democrats are hanging out over here. Democrat, Republican, Democrat, 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 Republican, 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 and Republican again, Republican, Republican, Democrat, 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 Republican, 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 Democrat, Democrat, Republican, Republican, Democrat, Democrat, Republican, Republican, Democrat, 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 Republican, Democrat, Democrat, Republican. I think it's safe to say that there definitely seems to be some serious corruption issues in the Republican Party. The Democrat Party is definitely a very corrupt party. People like Pelosi and Joe Manchin and Joe Biden, you know, these are very, very corrupt people. But the Republicans just take it to an entirely different level. They're right now rigging the next election in plain daylight, setting up a bunch of partisans in positions of power regarding the election process, clearly trying to attempt to do what they tried to do in 2020 once again. No shame. They are electing the most corrupt and deranged people across the country, or absolutely idiotic. I mean, it's just anything goes. They can say whatever, do whatever, and the only time they get in trouble is if they say something against the Republican Party, right? Tell the truth about the Republican Party, you get banished. Otherwise, you can say whatever hateful thing you want, and as long as the negative press doesn't get too out of control, you're good. Meanwhile, in the Democratic Party, somehow you end up cheating in your personal relationships, and that ends up getting you out of the party. So you're out of the party for cheating. In the Republican Party, anything goes as long as you don't call out the Republican Party. Right. Again, I'm going to repeat myself. Both parties, corrupt, garbage. They do not serve us. They serve the elite. But the Republican Party is special. Very special. And not in a good way. This is the Debate Me channel. Debate me in the comment section below. Click on the like button, subscribe, smash that bell. Be well. Let's see how corrupt you are. When you saw me going through all these Republicans that have done all this corruption and me pointing out that they seem to be special, how corrupt you are would be determined by how much that bothered you and that made you feel like you need to defend them and call me out and, the Democrats, this. How much of a sucker you are. How effective right-wing media and right-wing influencers' influence on you is. That'll be demonstrated by your feeling almost like I'm insulting you, by calling out people that you've never met, that you probably never would want to meet. But somehow me calling them out somehow made you feel like you need to defend these corrupt scumbags. That's an indication of how corrupt you might be or caught up. Food for thought. This is the Debate Me channel. Debate me in the comment section below. Click on the like button, subscribe, smash that bell. Be well.